My name is Cassidy Vance, and at 28 years old, my family still treats me like the fragile academic disappointment who couldn't cut it in the corporate world. But as the heavy soundproof door of my late father's reinforced basement in McLean, Virginia, slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss that vibrated through my chest, I realized their ignorance was about to become their downfall. My sister Jocelyn's voice crackled through the overhead Bose intercom system, dripping with a condescending sweetness that didn't mask the desperation beneath it, telling me to take my time and that I wouldn't be walking out until I signed over the $14.5 million trust fund our father had left exclusively to me. Beside her, I could hear the distinct rhythmic clink of ice against crystal and the sound of her husband, Trent, pouring a generous measure of 40-year-old Macallan Sherry Oak, a bottle that cost more than the average American's monthly mortgage payment. They looked down on me from the security monitors in the kitchen, convinced I was nothing more than a glorified desk clerk at the Pentagon, a paper pusher who spent her days organizing spreadsheets and filing travel vouchers for generals. They had no idea that my actual title is Director of Cyber Audit with a Level 7 Delta clearance, or that I spend my weeks hunting down black market financial anomalies and securing the very infrastructure they use to post their vapid lives on social media. The basement was a marvel of mid-century architectural paranoia, lined with sound-dampening acoustic panels and reinforced with a steel core frame that blocked all standard cellular signals. Yet as I stood there in my tailored navy blazer from Theory and my charcoal trousers, I didn't feel the panic they expected. I looked down at my wrist, tapping the sapphire crystal face of my Garmin MRQ Commander, a matte black military-grade smartwatch that cost $2,500 and possessed capabilities Jocelyn couldn't even dream of. I watched the seconds tick by in a dim crimson glow, my mind already calculating the logistics of the situation while my thumb traced the knurled edge of the watch's titanium housing. The air in the room smelled of old cedar and the faint ozone-heavy scent of the industrial-grade air filtration system humming behind the walls. I could hear Trent laughing in the background, boasting about how they would finally buy that vacation property in Aspen, a $6.2 million estate on Red Mountain they had been eyeing for months but couldn't afford on his dwindling commissions as a luxury real estate broker. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a pawn, but he failed to realize I had spent the last 6 years masterminding the most complex digital defense protocols in the Department of Defense. I sat down on the leather Eames lounge chair, the original 1956 vintage model father had cherished, and felt the cool, top-grain leather against my palms as I opened my laptop. A nondescript, heavy-duty Panasonic Toughbook that looked like a relic but housed a custom-built processor capable of cracking 256-bit encryption in minutes. Jocelyn's voice came over the intercom again, demanding to know why I wasn't crying or begging for mercy, her tone sharpening as she realized I wasn't following the script she had written in her head. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on the glowing screen, my fingers moving with a precision honed by thousands of hours of high-stakes cyber warfare. I bypassed the local Wi-Fi, which Trent had surely throttled, and activated a localized satellite uplink through my watch's encrypted tether. My eyes scanned the lines of code, the white text reflecting in my pupils as I began the process of freezing every single one of their joint assets, from their Chase Sapphire reserve accounts to the offshore portfolio they thought was hidden in the Cayman Islands. They thought they had trapped a bird in a cage, but they had actually locked themselves in a room with the person who held the keys to their entire existence. I could feel my heart rate steadying at a cool 62 beats per minute, the adrenaline sharpening my focus rather than clouding it, as I prepared to show them exactly what a Level 7 Delta clearance really meant. Growing up in the Vance household was an exercise in the art of being invisible, a masterclass in fading into the mahogany paneling of our estate in Great Falls while the world revolved around the blinding sun of my sister's existence. My father, General Silas Vance, was a man who measured worth in medals, public prestige, and the sharpness of a uniform's crease, and in his eyes, there was only one daughter who lived up to the family name. Jocelyn, now 33, was the undisputed pride of the Pentagon, a major in logistics who navigated the halls of power with a predatory grace, always clad in $2,000 Prada suits that she wore like armor. She was the one he bragged about at the Army-Navy Club over glasses of 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle, while I was dismissed as the academic disappointment who had wasted a prestigious education on a boring tech job that required no rank and garnered no accolades. The disparity between our lives was a chasm of his making, while Jocelyn spent her $150,000 salary on the lease of a pristine white 2024 Lexus RX 500h and an endless cycle of luxury galas, I played the part of the struggling middle-class clerk to perfection. I purposefully drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear fender and fading clear coat, and I retreated every night to a 500-square-foot studio apartment in a nondescript building in Arlington where the elevator smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. They saw the cramped quarters and the thrift store furniture as proof of my mediocrity, never realizing that I was funneling every spare cent of my actual $250,000 government salary and my private consulting bonuses into a sophisticated network of encrypted servers and offshore tracking protocols. While Jocelyn was busy social climbing and Trent was inflating his ego at high-stakes charity auctions, I was building a digital fortress. I spent my evenings in that tiny apartment surrounded by the low hum of 3 liquid-cooled workstations, my eyes strained from the glow of quadruple monitors as I mapped out the very financial spiderweb they were currently trying to trap me in. Father never looked close enough to see the calluses on my fingertips from hardware tinkering or the way my eyes never actually left the room when I was supposedly daydreaming. To him, I was just Cassidy, the girl who liked computers because she wasn't brave enough for the real world. He died believing his legacy was safe with his golden daughter, leaving the bulk of the liquid assets to me only because he assumed I was too weak and too stagnant to ever do anything but sit on the interest and live a quiet, pathetic life. Jocelyn and Trent's resentment had been simmering for months, fueled by the realization that their lavish lifestyle was a house of cards built on debt and my father's fading influence, while I held the keys to the $14.5 million vault. They looked at my old car and my modest clothes and saw a target, a soft girl who would break the moment the steel door of this basement clicked shut. They didn't understand that the girl who lived in the 500-square-foot studio had spent the last decade learning how to dismantle lives from the inside out, and that their arrogance was the only thing more inflated than the sticker price on Jocelyn's Lexus. Every time they mocked my boring career, I was actually auditing the very systems that kept their credit cards active, waiting for the moment they would finally overstep so I could show them the difference between a desk clerk and a ghost in the machine. The betrayal crystallized during my father's final annual military gala, an event of stifling prestige held at his $3.8 million estate in Great Falls, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the forced politeness of high-ranking officials. I was standing in a secluded private corridor near the library, the walls adorned with oil paintings of ancestors who had never known a day of true struggle, when Trent intercepted me with a look of frantic desperation masked by a thin layer of bravado. Trent, a man who presented himself as a high-stakes venture capitalist but was in reality a failed investor drowning under a secret $4 million gambling debt accrued at the Venetian Macau, pulled a crumpled set of transfer documents from the inner pocket of his bespoke tuxedo. He spoke in a hushed, jagged tone about family unity and financial restructuring, but the underlying truth was written in the sweat on his upper lip and the way his hands shook as he demanded I sign over my grandfather's inheritance to cover the massive hole they had dug for themselves. When I looked him in the eye and flatly refused to sign away the legacy meant for my own security to subsidize his reckless addiction, the mask of the Vance family decorum shattered completely as Jocelyn stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom that I had never seen before, all the sisterly affection she had faked for years evaporating in a single heartbeat of greed. "You are unstable, Cassidy," she hissed with a voice like shattering glass, her eyes darting around to ensure no guests were watching as she lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm with a mechanical, crushing grip that I knew would leave deep purple bruises on my pale skin by morning. Before I could leverage my own training to push her back, Trent moved with a surprising, panicked strength, and together they began dragging me toward the hidden stairwell that led to the reinforced basement. I didn't scream because I knew the acoustics of the estate were designed for privacy, and making a scene would only escalate their violence before I could reach my own tactical advantages. They forced me down the narrow stairs and shoved me into the soundproof safe room, a relic of my father's Cold War paranoia that he had upgraded with 400 pounds of industrial steel and a biometric locking mechanism that only he, and apparently his golden daughter, possessed the codes for. The heavy door swung on its precision-engineered hinges with a terrifyingly smooth motion before slamming shut with a bone-jarring thud that signaled the engagement of the triple-locking bolts. Immediately, the ambient noise of the gala, the distant string quartet and the muffled laughter of generals, was replaced by an oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The air in the confined space was chilled to exactly 64 degrees and carried the sharp, biting scent of cold concrete and the lingering ozone produced by the industrial-grade air filtration system. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the muffled click of their heels retreating on the floor above, knowing they were likely heading back to the party to play the roles of the grieving, worried siblings. They thought they had neutralized a threat by locking me in a vault, but they had actually provided me with the one thing I needed most to dismantle their lives. A secure, isolated environment with its own dedicated power grid and a direct fiber optic line that they were too technologically illiterate to realize was active. As I felt the phantom ache in my arm where Jocelyn had squeezed, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a hunter who had finally lured her prey into the perfect kill zone. Sitting on a cold, brushed aluminum chair that felt like an ice block against my skin, I didn't succumb to the panic they expected, but instead I leaned back and allowed my mind to pull up a precise, mental spreadsheet of the crimes they had committed with such reckless arrogance. For the last 72 hours, while Jocelyn was busy picking out silk table runners for the gala, I had been submerged in the digital trail of a $12.2 million procurement fraud scheme linked to a forward operating unit in the Deir ez-Zor region of Syria. The trail was disgusting in its simplicity, revealing that the specialized vehicle armor plating Jocelyn had personally signed off on and fast-tracked through the logistics chain was made of a substandard, defective composite that had already failed during an IED encounter, nearly costing the lives of two 19-year-old soldiers whose families believed they were protected by the best equipment the Vance legacy could provide. They weren't just the greedy siblings I had grown up with. They were dangerous predators who had traded the lives of American servicemen for kickbacks that funded their designer wardrobes and luxury car notes. I looked down at the glowing face of my Garmin watch, where the red digits of a countdown timer were steadily pulsing against the black background, signaling that Protocol 7 Alpha was already executing its first phase through the Pentagon's secure intranet. This was a fail-safe I had programmed months ago, a dead man's switch designed to trigger a comprehensive federal audit and a total asset seizure if I failed to check into my secure terminal at the cyber audit headquarters for more than 6 hours. I didn't need to waste my breath screaming or pounding my fists against the 400 pounds of reinforced steel because the silence in the basement was my greatest ally while the digital gears of the Department of Justice began to grind them into dust. I could almost hear the hum of the high-speed servers in the basement of the Hoover building beginning to flag the irregular transfers from Jocelyn's offshore accounts, and I knew that every second that passed was another nail in the coffin of their freedom. My heart rate remained a steady rhythmic thrum in my chest as I mentally visualized the agents from the Criminal Investigation Command already mobilizing their black SUVs, their sirens silent as they moved toward the Great Falls estate to intercept the traitors who thought they could bury me in the dark. I watched the timer hit the 4-minute mark, the scent of the ozone in the air becoming a comforting reminder of the technological power I wielded from the shadows, and I took a slow, deliberate breath of the filtered air, knowing that when that door finally opened, it wouldn't be to let me out on their terms, but to take them away in handcuffs. The sheer injustice of their lives, built on the blood of soldiers and the exploitation of our father's name, was about to be corrected by the very boring desk clerk they had mocked for a decade. I felt a cold, sharp sense of satisfaction knowing that within the hour, the $450 Macallan Trent was currently sipping would be the last taste of luxury he would experience for the next 20 years of his life. I just had to wait for the timer to hit 0, watching the crimson light flicker against the concrete walls like the embers of the bridge they had finally, irrevocably burned. Exactly 3 days before I found myself staring at the reinforced concrete of my father's basement, I had been submerged in the windowless, hypersterile environment of a SAF at the Pentagon, a room that smelled perpetually of stale Colombian roast coffee and the dry, metallic tang of burnt electronics from overclocked servers. I sat there for 14 hours straight under the hum of fluorescent lights, meticulously assembling a digital mountain of evidence that comprised over 1,400 pages of forensic bank statements, redirected wire transfers and damningly explicit encrypted telegram chats between Trent and his high-stakes bookie in Macau. Every line of code I decrypted revealed a new layer of their depravity, especially when I cross-referenced the equipment logs for the Syrian theater, where Jocelyn's digital signature sat neatly at the bottom of a procurement order for 400 sets of Level 4 ceramic body armor that she knew was actually Grade B industrial plating. I felt a cold, clinical detachment as I watched the data flow across my screen, documenting how she had pocketed a $380,000 kickback from a shell company registered in the Seychelles just 48 hours after the substandard plates were loaded onto a C-17 Globemaster at Dover Air Force Base. I didn't hesitate when I bundled these files into a massive, encrypted package known in my department as the Manila folder, a digital kill shot that I routed directly to the secure servers of the Judge Advocate General's Corps and the FBI's elite white-collar crime division in Washington, D.C. The trap was not just set. It was locked, loaded, and aimed at the very heart of their existence long before I had even selected my navy blazer for the gala or pulled my aging Honda out of its cramped parking spot in Arlington. I had ensured that the transmission was delayed by a 72-hour dead man's switch, a protocol that required my specific biometric override to cancel, meaning that by the time Trent handed me those fraudulent transfer documents in the library, the federal government already had more than enough evidence to dismantle their lives 10 times over. I had even included the GPS coordinates of the Great Falls estate and the specific blueprint of the safe room where I was currently sitting, knowing that the tactical teams would need that information for a clean breach. As I leaned my head against the cold aluminum back of the chair in the dark, I realized that Jocelyn and Trent were still celebrating a victory they had already lost 3 days ago in a room they weren't even cleared to enter. They thought they were playing a game of intimidation, but I had been conducting a symphony of systemic destruction, and the final movement was about to begin with the sound of a battering ram against the front door. The irony of the situation was a bitter, satisfying weight in my chest. The very security measures my father had installed to protect his secrets were now the only things keeping my sister and her husband from seeing the blue and red lights already turning the manicured lawn of the estate into a crime scene. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the shock on Jocelyn's face when her Prada-clad world finally collided with the cold, unyielding reality of a federal indictment, and I knew that every hour I spent in this silence was worth the decades of justice I was about to deliver. Upstairs, the grand gala reached its decadent peak as 150 members of the military and political elite stood on the hand-scraped oak floors, sipping vintage Veuve Clicquot and nibbling on Wagyu beef crostini, entirely unaware that a twin-engine Sikorsky U-60 Blackhawk helicopter was already 3 miles out, banking sharply over the Potomac River with its lights blacked out and a specialized tactical team checking their breach charges. While the muffled vibrations of the party filtered through the floorboards as a rhythmic, ghostly thrum, Trent and Jocelyn were undoubtedly standing at the marble-topped bar in the library, clinking their glasses of 40-year-old Macallan in a premature celebration of their victory, convinced that the oppressive silence of the basement would eventually crush my resolve and force me to surrender the $14.5 million they so desperately needed to cover their tracks. They viewed me as a broken woman trapped in a tomb, but I felt a surge of cold, clinical adrenaline as I stood up from the aluminum chair and smoothed the front of my charcoal gray blazer, a garment they mocked for its $40 price tag but which was actually a custom-engineered piece of equipment lined with flexible Kevlar weave panels and integrated with a low-frequency signal repeater. I took a slow, measured breath of the ozone-tinged air and turned my head with predatory slowness to look directly into the aperture of the hidden pinhole camera tucked behind the third acoustic panel from the door, a lens they were certain I hadn't detected during my years of being the invisible sister. I knew they were watching the monitor in the kitchen, waiting for the first sign of a tear or a desperate plea for mercy, so I stepped closer to the camera until my face filled their screen, my expression as unyielding as the 400 pounds of steel holding me in. With a ghost of a smile that never reached my eyes, I moved my lips with exaggerated clarity, mouthing 2 words that I knew would haunt their nightmares for the next 2 decades. Time's up. At that exact moment, the countdown on my Garmin hit 0. Sending the final burst of encrypted packets through the satellite link and triggering the immediate deployment of the FBI's hostage rescue team and the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Above me, the ceiling groaned as the first flashbangs detonated on the lawn, the sound a distant thunder that signaled the end of their facade and the beginning of their reckoning. I could almost imagine Jocelyn dropping her crystal glass, the expensive scotch splashing onto her Prada heels as the front doors were kicked off their hinges and the polite chatter of the elite was replaced by the bark of tactical commands and the heavy stomping of combat boots. I didn't need to be upstairs to know that the life they had built on the blood of soldiers and the exploitation of our father's name was collapsing in real time, falling apart at the seams under the weight of 1,400 pages of evidence they never saw coming. I stood there in the center of the safe room, surrounded by the cold concrete walls that were supposed to be my prison, feeling more powerful than I ever had in the stifling light of the Vance family legacy. The silence in the basement was no longer an instrument of their intimidation, but the quiet before the storm that would finally clear the air of their corruption once and for all. I simply waited for the hydraulic hiss of the door to release, knowing that when the light finally flooded back in, it would be held by men in tactical gear who answered to me, not to the golden daughter who had finally run out of time. Suddenly, the absolute power to the entire $3.8 million Great Falls estate cut out with a heavy mechanical thud that echoed through the ventilation shafts, plunging the massive house into a pitch-black void as the $20,000 Swarovski crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom went dark and the climate control fans sputtered into a silent halt. In the sudden heavy vacuum of the basement, I felt the slight shift in atmospheric pressure a split second before the reinforced windows on the ground floor shattered under the synchronized impact of tactical breach charges, sending shards of premium tempered glass flying across the hand-woven Persian rugs like a hail of diamonds. A specialized tactical team from the Criminal Investigation Division, supported by FBI hostage rescue units, breached the perimeter with a series of blinding flashbangs that detonated with a thunderous roar, their magnesium flares illuminating the estate in strobing bursts of violent white light. Through the Bose intercom system, which I had backhacked minutes earlier using a brute force bypass on my Panasonic Toughbook, I heard the clinical chaos of a high-stakes federal raid erupting in the rooms above me. Jocelyn's high-pitched, indignant scream pierced the air, a sound of pure terror that was quickly drowned out by the rhythmic heavy thud of insulated combat boots storming across the polished white oak hardwood floors. I adjusted my volume slider on the laptop, listening as the sharp, authoritative bark of a lead agent cut through the sounds of breaking porcelain and furniture being overturned, his voice booming with the weight of the United States government as he shouted the command for everyone to get on the ground and stay there. I could hear Trent's pathetic, stuttering attempts to invoke my father's name, his voice cracking with a desperation that suggested he was finally realizing that a $4 million gambling debt was the least of his problems. The intercom captured the metallic ratcheting of zip-tie handcuffs being cinched tight around wrists that were used to wearing Patek Philippe watches and the heavy, muffled grunts of men being forced into the prone position on the floor they had stood so proudly upon just moments ago. Down in the belly of the house, I stood in the center of the dark safe room, the only light coming from the dim crimson glow of my Garmin watch and the flickering status LEDs of my encrypted uplink, watching the signal bars pulse as the federal agents moved toward the basement coordinates I had provided in the 7 Alpha packet. The smell of the cold concrete was now mixed with a faint hint of gunpowder drifting through the HVAC system, a scent that signaled the total and final demolition of the Vance family's fraudulent legacy. I didn't flinch when the heavy steel door began to vibrate from a series of rhythmic metallic blows, knowing that the specialized breaching saw was currently cutting through the locking bolts that Jocelyn had trusted to keep me buried. My heart remained at a steady, cool pace because I had calculated this outcome down to the millisecond, and as the steel hinges groaned under the pressure of the tactical team's entry, I knew that the darkness of the basement was about to be replaced by the harsh, honest light of a crime scene investigation. I stood perfectly still, my hands visible and empty, waiting for the hydraulic hiss that would announce my liberation and my sister's permanent incarceration, feeling a cold sense of justice finally settling into the marrow of my bones. I tapped the final sequence into the sapphire glass of my Garmin MRQ, sending a localized override signal to the basement's magnetic strike plate that caused the 400-pound steel door to click open with a heavy, pneumatic sigh of surrendered pressure. I stepped out of the darkness and ascended the stairs with a slow rhythmic gait that echoed against the cold concrete, and as I crested the final step into the main living area, I was met by a scene of absolute, clinical devastation where the $3.8 million estate had been transformed into a high-stakes tactical grid of dancing red laser sights. The air in the grand foyer was thick with the gray haze of discharged flashbangs and the sharp metallic tang of ozone from the breached security systems. And there in the center of the wreckage, sat Jocelyn on her knees in her ruined $4,000 Oscar de la Renta silk gown, her face a smeared mask of expensive mascara and genuine soul-deep terror. Beside her, Trent was pinned face down against the 5-figure silk Persian rug, his cheek pressed into the intricate floral patterns while heavy-duty industrial zip ties bit deep into his soft, pampered wrists, causing him to let out a series of muffled, pathetic whimpers that no longer carried any weight. My father, General Silas Vance, stood frozen in the center of the chaos, his chest puffed out in a reflexive display of a rank that no longer protected him. But the 24-year-old special agent in the tactical vest didn't even glance at the silver stars on his shoulders as he firmly shoved the legendary general toward the mahogany-paneled wall. The young agent's movements were precise and devoid of the reverence my father had spent 40 years demanding, and I watched with a cold, detached fascination as the man who had always been the apex predator of our family was ordered to spread his feet and place his hands behind his head like any common criminal. I walked past the debris of shattered crystal and overturned catering trays, my footsteps silent on the hardwood as I moved toward the kitchen island where the lead investigator was already cataloging the contents of Jocelyn's encrypted laptop. Jocelyn looked up at me, her eyes widening as she saw me standing there in my unwrinkled charcoal blazer, realizing for the first time that I wasn't the victim she had tried to bury but the architect of the very storm that was currently tearing her world apart. She tried to speak, her mouth opening to offer some desperate lie or a sisterly plea for mercy, but the words died in her throat when she saw the Level 7 Delta credentials I pulled from my pocket and handed to the CID commander with a sharp, professional nod. The commander, a man who had been briefed on Protocol 7 Alpha 30 minutes prior, stepped aside to give me access to the central terminal while my father watched in stunned, horrific silence as the daughter he had dismissed as a desk clerk began directing the federal agents with the authority of a woman who held the keys to the kingdom. I didn't look back at them as I began the final sequence of the asset seizure, my fingers flying across the keys with a speed that finally betrayed the years of hidden expertise I had cultivated in the shadows of their neglect. The living room was no longer a place of family gatherings or military prestige. It was a crime scene where the legacy of the Vance name was being systematically dismantled by the one person they had never bothered to truly see. I felt the weight of their gaze on my back, a mixture of shock, hatred, and the sudden crushing realization that the power dynamic had shifted forever, but I remained focused on the scrolling lines of code that represented their total and final ruin. Every cent of the $14.5 million trust fund was now locked behind a federal firewall that only I could penetrate. And as the agents led my family out into the night in a procession of shame, I knew that the silence of the basement had finally been replaced by the loud, undeniable roar of justice. My father's stars didn't matter, Jocelyn's Prada didn't matter, and Trent's gambling debts were now the property of the Department of Justice, leaving me alone in the wreckage of the home that had tried to erase me, standing tall as the only person left who truly understood the cost of loyalty and the price of betrayal. Cassidy, tell them you are crazy and that this is all some kind of sick, delusional breakdown from the stress of the estate, Jocelyn shrieked with a voice that had devolved into a jagged, desperate rasp as she saw me emerge from the shadows of the basement stairwell with a calm that clearly terrified her more than the tactical teams currently dismantling her life. I didn't raise my voice or offer the emotional outburst she was fishing for because in the world of high-level cyber audit, the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least amount of leverage. So I simply walked past her ruined silk silhouette and handed a ruggedized federal tablet to the lead investigator, a stern man in a windbreaker with FBI embroidered in high-visibility yellow across the back. The routing numbers for the illegal Macau transfers that funded Trent's $4 million gambling hemorrhage are clearly indexed on page 42, along with the encrypted metadata proving they originated from the family's private offshore trust, I said with a clinical precision that cut through her hysterical sobbing like a scalpel. I swiped the screen to reveal the next set of damning documents, my thumb steady against the reinforced glass as I pointed to the red-flagged spreadsheets that detailed the systematic betrayal of every soldier wearing our father's name. The ballistic test failures for the substandard armor plating that nearly killed those two specialists in Syria are documented on page 89, and as you can see by the time-stamped authentication logs, both the procurement bypass and the final safety sign-off carry her specific Level 4 digital signature, which was accessed from her Pentagon terminal at 2:14 p.m. on the 14th of last month. The silence that followed my statement was heavier and more suffocating than the 400 pounds of basement concrete I had just escaped, a thick and pressurized void where the only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant, muffled thud of a Black Hawk circling overhead. Jocelyn's jaw dropped as she looked from the tablet to my face, the realization finally sinking into her marrow that the boring little sister she had mocked for years wasn't just a witness but the primary architect of her permanent downfall. Trent let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a choke, his forehead still pressed against the expensive Persian wool as the gravity of a 20-year federal sentence for procurement fraud and money laundering began to settle over him like a shroud. My father, the great General Silas Vance, looked at the screen and then at me, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray as he recognized the high-level Delta encryption markers on the tablet, finally understanding that my desk job was a cover for a level of authority that superseded his own even at the height of his career. There was no more screaming, no more condescending nicknames, and no more illusions of power left in the room. There was only the cold, hard data of their crimes reflecting in my eyes as the lead investigator nodded to his team to begin the formal processing. I stood there in my $40 blazer, watching as the people who had tried to bury me were finally forced to confront the digital ghosts I had spent years meticulously cataloging in the dark. Every bribe, every shortcut, and every lie they had ever told was now a permanent part of a federal record that no amount of family influence could ever erase. As the agents began to lift Jocelyn from the floor, her ruined dress trailing behind her like a shroud, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with the $14.5 million and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in 28 years, they finally knew exactly who I was. My father, General Silas Vance, looked at me with a desperate, calculating intensity, his eyes frantically searching for the shadow of the quiet, obedient daughter he had spent 28 years bullying into submission. But he found only the cold, impenetrable gaze of a federal auditor who had already moved past the point of familial sentiment. "Cassidy, please, we can fix this as a family. We can sit down and resolve these misunderstandings without dragging the Vance name through the mud of a public scandal," he pleaded with a voice that had lost its command room authority and devolved into a thin, pathetic tremor of self-preservation. I didn't blink as I looked at his wrist, noting the way the light caught the brushed platinum of his $15,000 Rolex Cosmograph Daytona, a timepiece that represented more than a year of a private salary and served as a sparkling monument to his own vanity and detachment from the troops he claimed to lead. I shifted my gaze from the luxury watch to the lead investigator, my voice dropping into a low, clinical tone that carried the absolute weight of a Level 7 Delta clearance as I delivered the final blow to the legacy he had spent a lifetime building on lies. He knew about the Syrian procurement fraud for at least 6 months, having received the initial internal red flag reports on his private encrypted server, and yet he chose to bury the evidence and do absolutely nothing to protect the lives of his soldiers while Jocelyn and Trent continued to siphon funds from the defense budget, I said with a terrifyingly calm precision. I watched as the color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the sallow gray color of wet ash, as I gave the explicit verbal authorization for the next phase of the operation. "Arrest him too," I stated firmly, my words echoing through the cavernous foyer of the Great Falls estate like a death knell for his career and his freedom. The look of pure, unadulterated terror that crossed the general's face in that moment, the realization that his rank, his stars, and his history of service were utterly powerless against the digital trail of his complicity, was the highest return on investment I had ever seen after a decade of working in the shadows of his neglect. I stood perfectly still as the 24-year-old special agent, who didn't care about the medals pinned to my father's uniform or the prestigious lineage of the Vance name, stepped forward with a pair of steel hinges and ordered the most powerful man I had ever known to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut over his wrinkled wrists was the most satisfying piece of data I had ever processed, a mechanical confirmation that the cycle of abuse and corruption was finally, irrevocably broken. As they began to lead him toward the front door where the flashing blue and red lights of the federal convoy illuminated the manicured lawn, I felt a profound sense of lightness that had nothing to do with the $14.5 million trust fund and everything to do with the fact that I had finally audited the one thing that truly mattered: the truth. My father, the man who had tried to make me invisible, was now being ushered into the back of a black SUV in full view of the neighbors he had always tried to impress, leaving me alone in the silent, shattered remains of his kingdom. I adjusted the sleeves of my $40 charcoal blazer, the Kevlar lining a hidden weight of protection against a family that no longer existed, and watched the taillights of the government vehicles disappear down the long, winding driveway of the estate. Family isn't about blood or shared names or the prestige of a military rank. Family is about who stays when the truth finally comes out, and as I stood in the dark foyer of the $3.8 million house, I realized that I was the only one left with a clean conscience and a future that wasn't written in a federal indictment. The aftermath of that single explosive night in Great Falls was a total and systematic collapse of the Vance dynasty, a controlled demolition of a legacy built on the hollow foundations of arrogance and lethal negligence. Jocelyn, the former pride of the Pentagon, was stripped of her rank in a humiliating public ceremony before being sentenced to 15 years in the United States disciplinary barracks at Leavenworth, her $2,000 Prada suits replaced by the coarse, industrial fabric of a standard-issue jumpsuit that bore no medals and offered no prestige. Trent's downfall was equally swift and clinical, as the Department of Justice handed him 12 years in a federal correctional institution for money laundering and wire fraud, his secret $4 million gambling debt in Macau becoming the primary evidence that sealed his fate and ensured he would spend his middle age in a 10-by-10 cell rather than a Red Mountain estate in Aspen. My father, General Silas Vance, faced the ultimate indignity for a man of his stature, as he was forced into a dishonorable discharge that wiped away 40 years of service benefits in an instant, losing his six-figure government pension and his $3.8 million estate to the federal government to satisfy the $12.2 million in restitution owed for the defective armor plating. The sprawling manor that once hosted the military elite was liquidated at a government auction, its mahogany halls emptied of the oil paintings and the vintage Macallan to pay for the lives he had endangered with his silence. While they began their new lives navigating the rigid gray reality of federal incarceration, I moved into a sun-drenched penthouse in the heart of Rosslyn, a space characterized by floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the Potomac and the very Pentagon halls I still walked with a level 7 Delta clearance. Every square inch of the 3,000 square feet was paid for by my own hard-earned salary and the performance bonuses I received for dismantling one of the largest procurement fraud rings in recent Department of Defense history. I sat on my new gray velvet sofa from Restoration Hardware, a piece that cost exactly what I had earned through merit, and watched the sun set over the city while the low hum of my secure server array provided a comforting rhythmic backdrop to my newfound peace. The $14.5 million trust fund remained untouched in a high-yield account, a safety net I no longer needed but kept as a reminder of the grandfather who had seen a spark in me that my own father had tried to extinguish. There is a profound, quiet irony in the fact that the invisible daughter ended up being the only one capable of standing in the light of the truth, while the golden children and the decorated hero were buried by the weight of their own greed. I finally realized that family isn't defined by the blood that flows through your veins or the prestigious name embroidered on a uniform, but by the integrity you maintain when no one is watching and the courage to hold the line even when the enemy is sitting across from you at the dinner table. As I looked out at the lights of Washington, D.C., I felt no lingering bitterness, only the cold, sharp satisfaction of a successful audit, knowing that the cost of betrayal is always higher than any bribe can cover. The Vance name was gone, dissolved into the fine print of a federal indictment, but Cassidy Vance was finally free, living a life of hyper-realistic clarity where the only thing that mattered was the weight of one's own character. Life is not a series of grand gestures or inherited titles. It is a meticulous collection of choices, and as I closed my laptop for the night, I knew that I had finally balanced the books of my past. Today, the $14.5 million trust fund that was once the catalyst for my family's greed and my own temporary imprisonment has been fully reallocated to the construction and operation of a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center in Bethesda, Maryland, specifically designed to provide cutting-edge prosthetic care and neurological recovery for soldiers who were severely injured by the defective equipment my sister approved. I sit in the profound, intentional silence of my high-rise apartment, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the white oak floors as I hold a physical letter in my hands, a piece of heavy cream stationery from a sergeant who was one of the 2 specialists nearly killed by the faulty armor plating in the Syrian desert. He writes with a jagged but determined hand about the grueling months of physical therapy he has endured and the miraculous moment he was finally able to walk again on his own 2 feet, a triumph made possible by the very funds Jocelyn and Trent tried so desperately to steal from me. The weight of the paper feels more substantial than any of the medals my father ever wore, a tangible piece of evidence that the cycle of destruction they initiated has finally been transmuted into a legacy of healing and genuine service. I made the decision months ago to permanently block the collect calls originating from the federal correctional facilities in Leavenworth and West Virginia, effectively cutting the last frayed tether to the people who shared my DNA but never my values. They spent my entire life demanding my silence, treating me as a background character in their grand narrative of power and prestige. And now I have granted their wish with a clinical, absolute finality that leaves them with a lifetime of quiet contemplation behind 10 by 10 cinderblock walls. There is no more manipulation, no more condescending nicknames, and no more atmospheric pressure from their crushing expectations, only the steady hum of my own successful life and the knowledge that the Vance name now stands for accountability rather than corruption. I look out the window at the distant silhouette of the Pentagon, knowing that while I still walk those halls with a level 7 Delta clearance, I do so as a woman who is no longer defined by the shadows of her father or the brilliance of her sister's false light. The true moral of this story is that family isn't found in the blood we share or the prestigious estates we inhabit, but in the quiet, unyielding integrity of the choices we make when the world isn't watching. I have audited my past and found it wanting, but the future I have built with my own hands is balanced, solvent, and entirely my own. As I place the sergeant's letter into a dedicated file on my desk, I realize that cutting off the toxic anchors of my heritage wasn't just an act of survival, it was the final, necessary step in becoming the person I was always meant to be. The silence in my home is no longer a prison, but a sanctuary where the truth is the only currency that matters. And for the first time in 28 years, I can breathe the air of a life that is completely, undeniably mine.